So some of the basic principles for which services we wanted to favor involved picking ones that had the strongest evidence base and external validation, services that would be more responsive to cost sharing. So part of this is to help encourage consumers to use high value services, and we would want to pick high value services to which we thought consumers would respond to lower cost sharing. One of the things that came up very early on in that first meeting is we have to really be worried about the complexity of the plan. Simplicity is really important. So we've tried to minimize the type of nuance so you don't have dramatically different cost sharing for the same service based on your clinical condition. We were very worried about communication and complexity and a whole series of issues related to that. And then there's a range of other considerations like the equity issues, adverse selection, and of course your view of that depends on what you think is going on with the risk adjustment models, impact on special populations, and then the overall risk pool that's happening between the exchanges and other populations. So I'm not going to read all these services, mostly because I can't pronounce many of them well and Mark will mock me, but you can see on the slide a list of the services that we consider high value to have reduced, largely actually eliminated cost sharing. There's a whole range of services there, and then we'll linger for a second and then we'll go to the next slide. There were a series of drug classes which were high value for which we recommended reduced cost sharing, understanding that when folks implement this plan, they may still want to retain the incentives for to allow competition amongst the branded drugs. So it might not be every drug, or that would be up to the plan whether it was every drug or just some drugs in class, but these are the classes that we identified as high value. Understanding that having a high value plan is not just using the right services, but also purchasing these services efficiently. So that requires some maintaining of competition between different sets of products. But these are the high value branded classes that we focused on, and go to the next slide. For a series of low value services, we had some specific ones, things like spinal fusion. I'm going to skip over you know why I'm skipping over it, vitamin D testing, and I can say proton beam therapy for prostate cancer. So those are examples of some of the low value services. Next slide. Vertebroplasty, see I said it, for those keeping score. Then in order to make it balanced, we had to pick a set of services that are high value in some cases, low value in other cases, but overall we considered services that collectively might have some limited value and have modest increased cost sharing on some of these services. What makes them useful in helping maintain the actuarial value is that they're widely used. So we had marginal changes to outpatient specialist services, x-rays and some imaging, high cost imaging, non-preferred branded drugs, for example. So we increased cost sharing on some broad classes of services to maintain the same actuarial value in the plan. Next slide. So I want to emphasize that if you look at the handout, you'll see these lists, all the sets of services I went through will be listed in the handout. Understand that this is just one version of what a plan design could look like. Whether or not the numbers balance in your population will depend on the characteristics and the utilization patterns of your population. So people have to do their own actuarial analysis. Although we think it would, broadly speaking, come close. And of course, you may make other choices than we did about how to balance the high and the low value services, not just which services, but how much to reduce the cost sharing or how much to raise the cost sharing, given what your interests are in the process that you typically go through. So while Mark was correct, I pressed him for a long time for a concrete plan, which I did, and he did deliver. We have at the end an example of a plan, recognizing that anyone can come up with somewhat different choices. So the key points are selection of the high value services, the level of cost sharing reduction for those high value services, picking the low value services, deciding how much to increase cost sharing for those services, and then building it around a particular base plan. We picked silver, you could have done gold. I'm particularly personally worried about what's going to happen in bronze, which at least in Massachusetts has a significant market share, and we may have been very successful in getting people coverage, but we really have to worry about whether or not that coverage removes the barriers for managing chronic conditions and accessing a number of other high value services. So This is one concrete example. We hope it begins the conversation. We certainly don't think we have the best possible plan or that it's in any way the end of the conversation. Next slide.